I have recently misplaced my special microphone, but anyway, hopefully this will suffice. So I want to get into quite a delicate and complicated matter, which I do think I will thoroughly cover, even though I haven't prepared perhaps sufficiently into quoting things precisely, but I think I'll be able to refer to them well enough and explain the contents therein that whatever sort of detail, grammatical variation in what I will be quoting and what I will be speaking on will be reconcilable with just, a medium amount of rigor and careful, uh, let's say, reinterpretation and duplication of the things that I will be explaining. So I'm going to get into some very important moral issues, and then I will also be using the South African legal system, specifically the Constitution, but I will also be making comments on the general kind of political attitude and the contents of the political arena and political discourse at the moment, and just to kind of give an example of just how far off the track we have gotten, just how far we have betrayed the morality of the new South Africa, and just how institutionally corrupt the politics of South Africa is, but also specifically the institutionalized corruption in the legal theory itself that has adapted to this new status quo, and seeks to facilitate this kind of moral denigration and derogation of the supreme uh, efficacy that the South African Constitution was supposed to guarantee and ensure to its citizens, and how things have gone so badly wrong in terms of its reinterpretation and its devaluing of its most sacred values, in a now quite toxic proto-fascistic political discourse that facilitates an endless amount of political unaccountability, and such and such. Such as the cultural degeneration of our times, which we see specifically in the influence of the American legal structure in its tutelage and its untoward professional treaties and other such, sort of toxic intellectual atmosphere that has come noxiously wafting over from America to also infest our academy in South Africa, our race and gender studies, and such, as we were infected by this proto-fascistic ideology which undermines and betrays the values of the Constitution, and which, now public intellectuals and justices themselves will even make legal, or give their legal opinion in public as to developing a moral framework which has this pollutant, and morally polluting, a proto-fascistic ideology and philosophy infused in all of its sentiments and disgusting, well, as I say, it leads to the state of an institutionalized corruption, which is now what we sit with. And the question really is that can the new South Africa be resurrected? Because it stands dead and betrayed and murdered by these war criminals in the making. But already the constitutional damage that they have wrought, they have set upon their backs a target for some kind of perhaps future Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also perhaps a tribunal of the kind of the Nuremberg trials, if things do precipitate as they seem to be ever advancing toward, the replay of Weimar Germany, essentially. Just instead now the Nazis are black, and therefore they think that they cannot consider themselves to be as evil as the Nazi regime, as morality has somewhat reset itself back to the time of Weimar Germany, when we must remember that Hitler was in fact the most popular leader in Europe before the war. And in the same way, we have much the same crazy, immoral, superficial virtue signaling moral vacuousness that has infused journalism, infused... Anyway, let me rather focus on starting from the intellectual side of things, starting from the basics. Now, I will give some general moral primer, just to talk about the subject of ethics and the subject of how, at least in a secular way, you can have a justice system that respects values and that has something which we call the practice of equality. Because equality can never be a right, it can only be a practice. And in some sense, the right to equality is something that, in some sense, can only be guaranteed by two legal principles that must be in effect in a legal system, which is something like the rule of law, which is itself dependent on another sort of principle, which is something like... well, it kind of has two subcomponents that are somewhat necessary and bound within the concept of the rule of law, which is that equal protection under the law and the necessity for the form of substantive law taking the iteration of laws of general application. Those are not sufficient, but something, I would say that those are the kind of the bootstrap necessities to having the practice of equality functional within a legal system. And in some sense, equal protection under the law itself is even slightly vague and ambiguous, which is why Section 9 in the South African Constitution is so laborious. And in some sense, it cannot even be understood without reference to Section 36. These things must be read in conjunction. Both mention explicitly the word equality in their provisions, but you can see that they both are highly infused with speak over those two general things that I just spoke about: equal protection under the law and laws of general application. Because in some sense, there's no such thing as the right to equality, because in some sense equality is about the treatment and balancing and fair balancing of all the other rights in how the exercise of one and governmental policy that seeks to advance and promote the access of the enjoyment of the rights of some, potentially at the sequestering or the hindrance of the rights of others, potentially. And in those rare policy circumstances in which such devices can be envisaged, then the government certainly must make itself vulnerable to counter-argument on behalf of the public interest that the infringement of any right, whether it be unnecessary because there are less restrictive means in order to fulfill the same objective, and in some sense government cannot make itself fundamentally unassailable and unaccountable through, in some sense, leaning into its own inability and unintelligent policy creation, that it now is necessary to even, in a more far-reaching sense, infringe upon the rights of others, merely because it wishes, supposedly, and it promises that it wishes to seek redress and it wishes to seek enhancement of somebody else's rights at the extravagant and deplorable and exacerbated expense of other people's rights. I mean, obviously then government has literally lost its legitimacy. It has certainly lost its legitimacy de facto in the structure of the Constitution, because anyone should be able to raise an objection that the infringement of the right is not justifiable. Now, what you'll notice in the limitations clause and in Section 9, there is no talk of the governmental prerogative. The government does not have a prerogative to rely on in order to insulate its chosen policy device in order to effect some kind of infringement of somebody else's rights. In the practice of equality, the infringement must not just be rationalized as as hypothetically functionally legitimate. It has to be justifiable in practice, and in practice it must be able to endure pragmatic counterfactual, the court must make an actual finding as to the pragmatic validity of the alternative measures that are raised against the government's policy. It cannot just say, well, the government enjoys a governmental prerogative to do these things, and it is empowered by the Constitution. It is not explicitly empowered by the Constitution. In some sense, government as a whole is empowered, including the judiciary, in equal part to the executive and legislative branch. And the judiciary has been shirking its responsibility in order to accede to something as poisonous as an executive or a legislative prerogative, which is not justifiable. In some sense, if you want to talk about a governmental prerogative, it has the right to take the first bite of the cherry, and the citizen, even an individual citizen, has the right to take an even bigger bite of the same cherry, and even to demand that the government has taken too much of the bite in the first place, that it has oversubscribed its first pole position to make the first attempt, or something like that. But in some sense, the government has no automatic legitimacy, just merely being hypothetical legitimate in its purpose as being outlined in the Constitution, and then somewhat its measures being rationalized in some way. No, they cannot just merely be rationalized in some abstract hypothetical. They must be justified in practice, in review of the facts, of the findings, and then in some sense, even if the government does not wish to take account of its own track record and not wish to make amends with its own evaluation and ongoing monitoring of its own efficacy in its policy, then it is a government that, in some sense, has delegitimized itself in the eyes of the court and cannot be protected by use of this prerogative or something like that. I mean, this is an invention which was imported from America, in which the legislature in America de facto owns the morality of the society. Just because they have a profane and degenerated legal system and legal tradition, I don't want to be too unkind. It has its charm, and it is certainly very old. So the American legal system is somewhat of an artifact of a constitutional, I don't want to be too unkind, because in some sense the South African Constitution stands on the shoulders of that historical experience. But we are certainly superior to them in our legal tradition, and now we have been reinfected by the old, whatever you want to call it, by an old world way of thinking, which is not appropriate and is certainly it has no place in the South African legal mind and legal theory. Also, its politics is disgusting, but I mean, in some sense, the identity politics in America is deserving for America, because America needs to precipitate a constitutional crisis so that perhaps they can grow up. So they can have that mess. It belongs to them. It does not belong to the new South Africa. And in the sense that it has been ran with, in the sense that it has been endorsed so across the board by journalism and academics and such, is only testament to the fact of the pseudo-intellectualism in the academy and to the moral depravity of the political arena, which obviously inclines itself towards shaping itself in the image of whatever might disguise and validate its own fundamental institutionalized corruption, which in law, in some sense, is something like the distance between the split prerogative and the ANC government. The ANC has, if you are going to, already I think that in such a wise in jurisprudence to award the legislative or governmental office with some kind of constitutional prerogative, which has no mention of it made in the Bill of Rights. In some sense, the closest thing is something like that government is empowered with a duty to essentially create affirmative action, but it has not done so constitutionally. It has done so, in some sense, in an anti-constitutional fashion, in a way that is explicitly racialist, in a way that explicitly undermines the values and the structure of the Constitution. But anyway, if you are going to, so even if you were to give it a kind of a weak, some kind of weak sense of a prerogative or something like that, as a legal subject to create jurisprudence around in the South African legal system, what you would find is that prerogative in some sense would have as a necessity that the leader of the NEC within the ANC has a prerogative that supersedes the prerogative of the leader of the party and the leader of the government. Cyril Ramaphosa takes his marching orders from, in some sense, the prerogative of the NEC, which is somewhat held, in council and in the NEC structure. Now, the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa himself is not the absolute head of that structure means that we have something like a split prerogative, which I would even say if you were going to create something like a governmental prerogative, then having that form of split prerogative would be wholly impossible to countenance. Judicially, the NEC or the structure of the ANC would have to be ruled as invalid, but in some sense you wouldn't have to or need to rule that invalid because government itself does not own a special prerogative. Any citizen can raise contradiction to government policy on the basis of it's in the public interest and on the basis of the rights in the Bill of Rights. There is no special countervailing prerogative that the government can use as a false authority to insulate itself against such a claim that might be made in the public interest. So in some sense, this invention of the prerogative itself should have never existed within South African law. But if it was going to exist, then there would be a fundamental problem between the split prerogative. And in some sense, how the ANC government functions with its split prerogative is what also facilitates its own internal corruption. But that is a political matter. That's not necessarily a judicial matter, but it has become mixed up into the judicial matter because the judges have given government the special right of prerogative, the special constitutional power, which is not mentioned in the Bill of Rights or the Limitations Clause, which is a complete ad hoc addition and usurpation of the supremacy and the structure of the Constitution, just because in some sense it was set up by that 2008 or 2009 secondary legislation. What was it called? The Promotion of Equality Act or something like that. Because that secondary legislation is also essentially itself fundamentally defective relative to the Constitution. And in some sense, because because the judiciary has essentially taken that Promotion of Equality Act as being itself a de facto use of the governmental prerogative to define the Constitution, it has allowed government essentially to supersede the provisions of the Constitution, which is itself judicially corrupt as well. And in some sense is another token of acquiescence that the judiciary has awarded to, in some sense, the institutionalized corrupted structures within the ANC. Now, I'm not complaining about the institutional corruption of the ANC. I'm complaining about the mirror of that corruption within the judiciary. That, and in some sense, I don't need to prove the facts that the ANC is institutionally corrupt. I don't have to prove that. I just have to prove that the state of the law itself is fundamentally substandard. It's not fit for purpose. It's defunct, and it's a betrayal of the new South Africa. And this also precipitates this disgusting epoch of fascistic politics and journalism and pontification by pseudo-public intellectuals and such and such. Let me just also just make in the round a comment about the kind of despicable public discourse that we sit with today. I saw a story, I mean, just today on my cell phone, in the news, that the police chief was, in some sense, airing this open public questioning the local police. So the national governmental police chief is on through Twitter questioning the Durban police people, the local police in some city municipality or whatever. He's questioning, this guy was a known criminal, why wasn't he already in jail or something like that, because there was some crime news about it. I mean, this is embarrassing. This is absolutely embarrassing. This is a police chief, the national police chief, instead of taking responsibility, because in some sense he is accountable for the failure of the police in the country. But instead of taking that accountability and making private inquiries and keeping his own counsel and making a professional audit of the situation and understanding the complexities of the matter at large, he airs this vague and embarrassing dramatization, pretending to ask a question in good faith, as if he wasn't himself responsible for the failing of the local police. It's absolutely disgusting. The flagrant unaccountability, the flagrant flouting of this, it's like a performance. As if he wasn't himself responsible. And in some sense, you can know why this kind of dramatization takes place. It's to, in fact, disguise the fact that in some sense his job is to protect organized crime in the highest form. That in some sense, I mean, first of all, in terms of organized crime in the middle of society, in some sense, you can't ever expect that to be sorted out. That will always, if people cannot be stopped selling drugs on the street corners, you can't expect there not to be mafia kingpins and mafia bosses and drug lords. Obviously, there are going to be, let's say, these middle organized criminal lords when there is freedom on the ground to perpetrate crime. That is why you need to have, let's say, effective policing on the level of petty crime in some sense. You need to have that. And in some sense, the police chief himself echoes this disgusting and profane idea that no, we don't need to crack down on the small guy. We only need to go after the middling lords or something, the middling criminal lords. I mean, this is a complete, abrogation of even how policing even functions. Just obviously, if there are going to be people on the corners of the street, they're going to be middling drug lords. The idea that you're going to stop crime because you're going to go after the people in the middle all the time, I mean, is itself a bit of a kind of never-ending a wild goose chase or something like that. But in some sense, we know why he's playing out this kind of drama, because in some sense it's bold-faced irony and sarcasm in some sense. Because the irony is that in some sense his job is to not go after organized crime, because the biggest organized crime in this country are his colleagues in the ANC government. And in some sense him asking the question, why haven't we caught these people who are leading the organized crime, is a better question asked directly at him, at the highest echelons of what he is in the middle of preserving and maintaining as an institutionalized corrupt system. In some sense, he might as well ask Cyril Ramaphosa and the leader of the NEC, or he might as well be asking that question of the NEC Council rather than of the local Durban police. I mean, you see this kind of suck up, kick down bullshit. That's fascism right there. Kick down, suck up. That's what the police minister does on the national level in South Africa. That's the state of policing in South Africa. That's the state of the justice system in a nutshell. Performative, fakery. It's a mockery. And it gets away with itself. Why? because fascism has become normalized, because of this racialist consciousness and this disgusting identitarian bullshit has been completely naturalized within our public discourse, so that you can get away with this kind of fakery and mockery of justice and of intellectual inquiry, so that he can pretend to be asking his question in good faith when it's really quite disgusting. I mean, as he wears his hat, have you seen the police chief's hat in South Africa? I mean, he might as well be a mafia kingpin himself. It's as if he is flagrantly telling people, we are the in-group criminals, and we do it. We're Robin Hood. We're doing it for the good guys. You know, this is how the merry men take over the revolution. You want to steal from the rich and give to the poor, and you're always going after the evil people. But what about pandering to this false consciousness and crystallizing the institutionalized corruption? Because you are correct enough to facilitate this disgusting performative sympathy, that you are the kingpin of sympathy in a society, that you know who to sympathize and who to go hard on. You're going to be hard on the local Durban police, as you don't give them the resources probably to stamp out the people on the street corners, but supposedly they have to go after the kingpins. That's what I mean. In some sense, that's not a you don't ask policemen why they haven't been able to catch the kingpins. You ask the prosecutors that. That's a complicated question why you don't convict someone in a court. Police, in some sense, police might be working badly with prosecutors as to why you don't achieve convictions. But in some sense, the inability to achieve convictions is all to do with the failing of the prosecutor, or the failing of the prosecutor to communicate well enough with the police structures as to why they cannot obtain and search out and properly sequester the evidence required in order to achieve a conviction. In some sense, it's either about the quality of the prosecution, or it's about the quality of the prosecution being able to, in some sense, manage the police. And what does the police chief do? He asks this about the local police. He doesn't keep his own counsel. He doesn't make a professional audit of the situation. In some sense, he's pretending like he isn't responsible for the lack of the conviction himself. You know, he just completely abrogates responsibility. There's no accountability in governmental structures in South Africa because of this disgusting kind of judicial passing forward of the buck always, that in some sense, well, they have the prerogative to act however they so wish. No one is allowed to speak out against their disgusting and depraved level of degeneration of governmental integrity. Standards will always just fall because no one is allowed to critique. Because if you critique or complain, then you can be labeled a racist, and then in the future they will try to create hate speech legislation so that they can completely control the public discourse. That is the trajectory in South Africa. That you have all of anything that you might say must be in line with the Promotion of Equality Act, which will have as its subsection, or as its further legislation promulgation into other forms of decrepit institutionalized corruption. That is the trajectory in South Africa. The legalization of fascism and fascist politics and fascist morality, and its legal positivism that covers its traces and validates its disgusting and juvenile mockery of the rule of law. Okay, now I focused too much on South Africa. Let me give now a recapitulation of the issue in reference to just, in some sense, pure morality. And in some sense, the ingredients of this are within the constitutional framework very clearly. You have values. You have values. Let me get to my notes. values are very important. Now, in practice, you also do have, in some sense, prerogatives. So just for in service of the argument, I will include that in my current discourse. So you have values, you have prerogatives. So when I say prerogative here, I merely mean is that there's a blunt form of management that usually occurs within organizations, and so there's some kind of leadership structure, and de facto they have an internal prerogative that needs to be respected within that internal organization. But in terms of adjudication and in terms of moral things, it is in some sense usually understood that then that headship, that leadership of that organization is just, it can't have more rights than the organization itself, just because it's using a prerogative within itself to coordinate itself. So in some sense, the prerogative only applies internally. It doesn't apply, so the fact of the prerogative only applies to internal relations within the organization. It doesn't relate to external controversy or external issues and contentions that are created after the fact of the internal prerogative has reached some kind of culminative issue or whatever. Because you have values and prerogative, and then you have obviously personal ethics in some sense, or just ethics in general, which are mostly made up of people's values, which you could call them personal values as well, as well as in our country we actually have quite a good morality in terms of as represented by the Supreme Constitution, because the morality in South Africa is actually one that is based on values. It is one that is based on values that also respect, let's say, a plethora of freedoms and such, and the value of freedom of consciousness and freedom of thought and freedom of speech and freedom of association. And in some sense, they are generally summarized as the main values being open, liberal democracy based on dignity, non-racialism, non-sexism, in some sense. Now, I'm going to give a primer on values just as a general kind of moral. In my view, there are 5 values, and I will relate them into the subjective frame because it's much easier to do that. So my 5 values, and in some sense there are only really 3 values, and 2 of them are what I call dangers. And in some sense, because the last 2 are dangers, they're all 5 of these values are negative values. And it's very important that they are negative values, because it is impossible to contend with someone's positive valuation of something. Because if they say this is a positive, you can't do anything with that, because you can only contradict it. You have to agree with them in some sense. So positive values, and I mean this in a substantive sense, a claim about a positive value, a claim about holding a value that is objectively positive, is immeasurable. It is insoluble. It cannot be countenanced in a respectable way in which there can be a different view or a different, so in some sense, positive values are poison, is what I'm basically saying. So all true values in the subjective sense, in the secular sense, are negative. So I'll go over these. So someone's individual subjective perception about value will include what is untruthful, what is uncareful, what is unserious. And then, in some sense, these 2 negative values will be that they, I think, can rightly have a reticence. They can rightly have a, what's the word? A correct amount of, let's say, I don't want to say fear or trepidation, but in some sense, a right amount of, in some sense, serious, careful, and true heuristic or in some superficial sense, they might have beliefs that represent a kind of limitation or bounded prescription in relation to positivity and kindness. Because positivity and kindness that is not qualified by an ongoing investigation as to if it is not, in some sense, in some context, and there will always be some context in which some amount of positivity or some amount of kindness will fail the test of being untrue, uncareful, or unserious. So in some sense, the positive conveyance of one's belief, because belief in some sense is always defective. There will always be a context in which a belief or even a set of beliefs will break. And so in some sense, the ongoing evaluation of these 5 values is a necessary procedure in life. They cannot ever be taken as an orthodoxy, as a dogma. In some sense, and in some sense, this set itself, I am in some sense saying, is the best model that I have found to actually keep an updated moral schema that is ethically workable and that is communicable in some sense. Because otherwise, I don't really see how one can share and ground and persuade and convince and negotiate between values of individuals without taking this approach. And anyway, in some sense, you can do this with people without explaining the tenets of this in some sense, but some people that can understand the kind of, from a moral philosophical kind of point of view, I'm just laying down a procedure, I'm laying down a process. So now in practice, let me get into some of how these values are operable in negotiation or in persuasion or in contestation or under a kind of mediation or conciliation process, but also perhaps also in a kind of adjudication process. If a kind of inquisitorial arbitrating figure were to make investigations under these lines, and they will see the moral reasoning behind someone's position or the lack thereof, that an individual can only know what sounds to them is unserious, or what sounds to them is untruthful, or what sounds to them as uncareful. Now, all of these things have their natural province and their natural limitation in some sense. In some sense, uncarefulness can be tolerated as long as there's enough seriousness and truthfulness. Uncarefulness might be tolerated. Obviously, uncarefulness will be aggravating to the party that is having, in some sense, what someone is saying and how they are saying it might be absolutely fine, but why they are conveying it in the way that they are conveying it might be itself a kind of indignity to behold. In some sense, it might be motivated in quite a malicious way, that in some sense the form that the communication is taking is so either laborious or is so designed to be taxing to the listener that it is in fact, in some sense, it is so devoid of any care. It does not wish to render any care to the listener, to the audience, or to its intended recipient. Now, in some sense, in judicial matters, you cannot necessarily expect the appearance of care, because in some sense what might appear to be uncareful might be necessary in the particular development, in the particular articulation, in the particular substantive deployment and unfolding of quite a serious and sophisticated and seriously, let's say, necessary truth that has yet to be told in the judicial context in some sense. And so judges in at least in the South African tradition understand that tremendous care of the interpretation of the words used and the careful grammatical precise faithfulness of the meaning conveyed by the speaker is to be attended to by the judicial officer, and the judicial officer himself is prone to egregious error and mistake, to not take proper care, to even imagine the great level of care that might be bound within the claim or the evidence given, or the argument being made by the participants in a trial. In some case, more so in a high court, less so in a magistrate's court. Magistrates' court are not courts of record. They don't quite have these same standards, although these standards of care, in some sense, are somewhat universal and are inculcated within the South African legal tradition. Magistrates' court does have some leeway to be less careful on these sorts of grounds, being they creatures of statute. Being they somewhat bound to the letter of the law and the regulation, and being quite blind and dumb as to the, I'm just saying that is the role of a magistrate, that is a creature of statute. It is itself, anyway, I'm not going to get into those kinds of distinctions, but that's an important legal sort of boundary to talk about. Anyway, moving on. The two positive values, in some sense, are quagmires of hidden uncarefulness, hidden unseriousness, and hidden untruthfulness, which can, in some sense, be paved over in a very insidious way. And so it is all, and in some sense, I keep on speaking about this topic in my other recordings when I speak profusely about how sustainability and sympathy have a direct proportional trade-off in relation often. That the more sympathy one is prone to ceding over and providing, the more unsustainable and, let's say, thoughtless and uncareful, unserious, or untruthful one is prepared to be in order to provide that kind of unchecked sympathy. Obviously, sympathy will label itself in the form of kindness or positivity. And so kindness and positivity are faux values. They can look valuable, and they are often the containers of devaluation of people's true ethical values that they actually contend. And in some sense, just because one hears an ethical breach does not mean that one needs to be right, but it is something that one should investigate. It is something that one should seek to hash out if there be potential for a common faith, if there be potential for a communication, an exchange, a negotiation, an exchange of values, an exchange of perspectives, an edification. Persuasion is a possible thing. In some sense, we have lost the art of equality, of the practice of equality, with this brittle and disgusting moral system, which is, in some sense, I talk about its historical sources. 3-hour recording that I made on sexuality, because in some sense it all comes from, to a large extent, third wave feminism, I would say, as fascism generally does come out of repurposed and misappropriated sexual norms and sexual morality and in some sense sexual dehumanization, as male sexuality has been maligned. We have created this very unwieldy kind of political structure. But anyway, that'll sound a bit strange, but let me just say that that's a large topic, and that's about the cultural history of this problem and of this moral crisis. But let me just put that aside. Um, and in some sense, all of this is somewhat a general symptom of our inability to communicate about our values and to grow our values authentically and genuinely, and not be, let's say, suppressed and invalidated by false authority and structures of false authority, and being forced to buy false and unaccountable sources of knowledge and irresponsible forms of appeals to authority as the basis for being true or correct. And so, truthfulness has come to be counterfeited, has come to be replaced by people that merely can use fancy words or something like that, or that can have some kind of credential or have some kind of piece of paper or some kind of token, and that they do not make themselves understandable upon investigation, upon negotiation, upon reasoning, as reasoning itself has been completely removed from discourse and been replaced with disgusting ideological narratives that have to do with disgusting sociological reductions, saying that people's moral consideration comes from their group categorization, that their identity, which belongs to the group, is what gives you your values in some sense, and therefore your values can be spoken about and spoken of by some false authority that claims to be acting in your best interest, and therefore they can bully other people around. So these are the kind of perennial problems bogging us down in morality. Now, in some sense, there are practical managerial things that have to do with prerogative, that in some sense organizations don't want to have their own court system. They don't want to have their own internal judicial system within a certain structure, especially ones in which people are manifesting their political preferences. And so the purpose of the organization is to get something done about your political preferences. And if that organization has a current leadership that doesn't look like it's going to deliver on your political views, then perhaps you should seek a different political organization to belong to. You cannot expect the prerogative to be subject to your own personal whimsy or something like that, just based on, in some sense, what has been the misnomer of the right of equality. People do not have the right of equality. There's no such thing as the right of equality. There is the practice of equality, which is how all the other rights are fairly balanced and measured in contradistinction with each other, in relation to each other, which means that essentially you have to read Section 9 with Section 36. You have to read the clauses about equality with the clauses on the limitation of rights in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit and going back into the South African legal situation, because I do think it perfectly maps the moral kind of thing. But let me talk about it morally first. Is that, so you've got values, you've got prerogative, and then you've kind of got ethics within the field, in some sense within the game of morality, in which you are playing the game of morality from your game piece, which is your personal ethics, which we are so lucky to live in a country that actually has a morality which properly respects personal ethics, and that has a facility for them to have their personal values properly brought to bear on matters that affect society in some sense, and matters that impact on all of our rights in the Bill of Rights, and governments potentially untoward infringement and encroachment over those rights, which has also happened quite recently in the COVID sort of stuff. But so this leads now just to a kind of a theme that I'll talk about in morality first, and then more specifically in the judicial context, is the issue of relatively justified. What is relatively justified? And versus, in some sense, objective, inverted commas, justification. Now, in some sense, I do think that justification is just about the only thing in any subject or any field in which you can honestly be saying to be achieving the promotion of the achievement of an objective justification. I do think that we can actually say that that is the entire purpose of the South African system of government in totality, that we are promoting and achieving the progressive realization of objective justification, at least within a secular context. But objective justification is, and this is complicated, is in some sense relative to a relative evaluation about what is relatively justified. In some sense, can we know that, well, is this just relatively justified in these circumstances, in these facts, in these with these factors in mind, with these structures in mind, these structures of the Constitution in mind, which are obviously those framing structures are the most important things in all the things that I just laid out, because they must frame all the other layers of relative relative matter and relative subject matter to do with the issue. So the framing structures, the outline of it, which is perfectly already laid out in the Constitution, although that outline has been betrayed by the current set of jurisprudence in some sense. So get what I'm saying is that there is reference of, even in the Constitution in some sense, progressive achievement towards an objective justification. But in the meantime, and in some sense always, we only have what is relatively justified on the path in that general pursuit of objective justification. So in some sense, we can say that we are striving to achieve objective justification, and we believe that we might have it, but we also know that we might be wrong. So in some sense, it is both relatively justified, but we are saying that we're striving towards objective justification. That is why we hear new cases. That is why we allow for appeals to occur, because we might be wrong. That is why we allow for review to occur. Okay? That's why we allow for a fresh instance, a fresh airing of the matter. And also why there should be, conventions of, I can't remember all the, a new cycle of conventional review and such and such. Anyway, although that hasn't happened in South African law in, I believe, quite a long time. But anyway, I'll just say as well that in America this is somewhat serviced by the circuit courts that they have in their appeal higher court sort of process. But the problem with America is that it's fractious, that they all have different state institutions, and the federal constitution is itself just sort of vague and embarrassing on the point of the rights in the Bill of Rights. In some sense, the American rights in the Bill of Rights are so dysfunctional, and they are so unamicable to remedy. They are too vague. They do not lead to clearly justiciable remedies. which is in some sense even realized by the makers of the Constitution themselves, because they did not place the Bill of Rights within the main body of the American Constitution, in the main body of the text. They put them all in the amendments because they knew that they didn't know what they were doing, essentially. And in some sense, that was a bit of, I would even argue, historically a concession that the American Revolution was premature. But anyway, that history is for the birds. I'm not complaining against history. I mean, I'm not also ungrateful to the American experiment. I'm I guess just troubled at how its experimentation in legal theory has now poisoned and continued this disgusting tradition of what I would call the Napoleonic corruption over the state, which in some sense allows for a disguised, shadowy governmental influences and unaccountable plutocrats and kleptocrats to get away with themselves, because their form of law is so decrepit and so untransparent that you can always procedurally exhaust. Because in some sense, America, the rule of law in America doesn't really exist, but in as much that it is defined in the American system, the rule of law in America is defined as due process, which is not the rule of law. Because in some sense, you need to have substantive laws of general application, not just due process. And in some sense, the idea in America that you have equal protection under the law because you have due process is not a justified claim. If you don't have laws of general application in substance, which means that you don't have permanent structures that in principle are complete, and America doesn't even believe that that's possible, perhaps, but they have also not looked at the South African legal tradition with our Roman substantive law, which is a philosophical principled computer in which the substantive law itself is complete and it is philosophical, and in some sense it must receive through the common law whatever legislation government wishes to do, which must also only function in terms of the framework of the Supreme Constitution. So all of our law in substance is done. We have laws of general application in South Africa. All legislation and regulations are extra bits of public good, are extra bits of device, and it must be absorbed within the current substantive legal structure. And because in our legal tradition now we have accepted this disgusting American device of governmental prerogative, which is, basically, America affords no citizen real integrity and dignity, because the state legislature is given a moral paternalism over the citizen. The state legislature is your moral father in some sense. That is what I would call the Napoleonic corruption. And in some sense it is something like it's something like a copy of the British system, in which the Parliament in Britain is sovereign. Parliament is sovereign over Britain, but you see, Britain has an ephemeral, cultural, half unwritten constitution, at least. Which is why it's very bad to replicate, because if you were to replicate it, you would have to go the way that South Africa did. The only way to recreate British political liberalism, classical liberalism in some sense, the only way to inculcate it is to go the South African route. The American route doesn't achieve it. And in some sense, because they use their legal structure to have within it pretty promises, like the Bill of Rights, which are in their amendments of their constitution, of their federal constitution, they don't achieve it, because they've abused their legal structure as a kind of political propaganda of something that they say that they are symbolically achieving, but they can never make justiciable in some sense. Because America does not have the rule of law, it just has a due process system. And so richer people, powerful people will always be able to use process in order to evade justice in some sense and to avoid accountability. And in some sense, everyone in America is also prone to levels of false authority, therefore, because experts can be leveraged in court cases, and the legalism is not strict enough in its substance to say, no, 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 we push back, because whatever the legislature says should be accepted by the courts will accept, because the courts are merely, in some sense, the secretary of the vague framing Bill of Rights in the federal Constitution, and whatever strictures there are in the state constitution, but essentially they are there to follow the mandate and to follow objectively what has been laid out by the legislation. And there is no substantive backbone in the law for the individual to push back against the state legislation or the state constitution. And in some sense, the problem is that the federal constitution is just too vague and embarrassing in that its rights do not confer real remedies. They are just there to be rationalized by the judge in favor of whatever legitimate government purpose comes across. Whatever the so-called purpose of the legislation of the legislature's desire must be given some purposeful effect, if it can be given some purposeful effect. Not in the South African system proper. Properly in the South African system, we have a backbone. No, we can either say, well, look, you do have, the government does have a duty to make affirmative action policy, but that doesn't mean that the form, that the policy that it wants to enact is going to be taken to be constitutional. And if there is a less restrictive means that is arguably more pragmatic or arguably more effective, then in the public interest, judges should order the government to repeal or to reform or to even, the judges might, I do agree with the general stance that essentially it should be sent back to government to politically absorb the update. But in some sense, if government is going to so continually delegitimize itself in its profanity and in its, decrepit unaccountability from the judicial point of view, then in some sense, I think the court should be more stern to issue judgments against the ANC government as a growing tyranny, as a growing unaccountable force that profits on false consciousness and ideological subversion, and in some sense has only been able to maintain its decrepit structures because the office of the public protector has been so weak, has been so itself part of the corruption and the fascistic malevolence and blah blah blah. But anyway, the point that I was getting back to around this relative justification and objective justification is mirrored a little bit in section 9 when it talks about maybe I should still fill out this concept in general. So when I talk about that something can be relatively justified, in some sense we can know for a fact that something will not be relatively justified when we judge it or contrast it into the fifth case of the limitations clause, E, which is numerated E in the subclause, in the limitations clause. If we can see an alternative route, an alternative policy, an alternative program, an alternative rationale that would suffice the same legitimate purpose, that would be less restrictive, then we can know for sure that what is relatively justified is a misnomer, or is a false authority, or is is pretending to be kind and pretending to be positive, but belies unseriousness, uncarefulness, untruthfulness, to put it in value terms. But now, in some sense, this in some sense means as well that when you are looking at people's decision making within the context of private individuals, um, under the under the controversial under the controversy, under the microscope of looking into an issue of a controversy involving unfair discrimination. This is what is meant when we're going into the topic of indirect discrimination against a protected ground. Indirect here does not mean that it has a tendency to cause discrimination on the basis of a ground, a protected ground. Indirect means that the objective criteria used in the decision making is not directly a discrimination against one of the protected grounds, but it indirectly, in its totality, amounts to targeting one of the grounds, one of the protected grounds, one or more of the protected grounds. Now, it's very hard for me to even conjure up such rare, exceptional circumstances where this is capable of existing, because there is such a plurality of human experience, there's such a plurality of human identity, that I don't think it is in fact possible to envisage an objective criteria that will perfectly indirectly discriminate against one or more protected grounds. So for example, one of the protected grounds is, in some sense, non-ageism is a value in the Constitution, non-ageism. So you cannot say, sorry, we're not hiring you because you're too old, but that would be direct discrimination. So the indirect discrimination would have to be, sorry, we're not hiring you because in your identity document, if you look at the two digits that are not right at the end, but are in the sixth position from the end, and the fifth position from the end, because those digits in those two positions correspond to the year of your birth. And so if you say, well, actually, I'm not discriminating against people that have an age of a certain amount, I'm discriminating against people in their identity documents, the numbers in those positions must fall within a certain range. And I'm saying that that's arbitrary. Well, obviously that's not arbitrary. In some sense, that's a thinly veiled disguise of indirectly appertaining to a person's age. That would kind of be an example of indirect discrimination, but generally speaking, indirect discrimination is almost never going to crop up. Because in some sense, I mean, I can't come up with examples, but I can give the principle of what it means. So indirect discrimination would be that I'm going to create a piece of criteria in my decision-making apparatus for why I'm going to hire someone for a job. And either that criteria says that is a weird kind of formulation, is a kind of a bit of irrational piece of garbage thinking. But in some sense, the garbage amounts to something like, you cannot be X, but you might be X, and that might be okay, but then you also cannot be Y, but then if you are Y, then you cannot be Z, and all X, Y, and Z are all protected grounds. So it's like, you must not fit into the category of having these protected protected categories. So I've created an arbitrary bit of let's say, standard. I've created a standard in my practice of hiring people, and in my practice of hiring people, I won't directly say that you can't be X, Y, or Z, but I've found a property. I've found actually, it wouldn't be a property. I found an attribute. I have found an attribute, and that attribute says that, in some sense, that attribute does not is somewhat ambiguous about whether it cares. It can either be a combination of ambiguity, or it can be set to one ground. But essentially, it's a proxy for a particular ground. But it must be a perfect proxy. It cannot be an approximate proxy. If it's an approximate proxy, it's not indirect discrimination. Please understand that. That's very important. If it is a proxy for indirect discrimination, it must be a complete proxy for either a combination of protected grounds or a protected ground in totality. It cannot be an almost eclipsing. It cannot be an almost representation of a protected ground. So in some sense, you can't just say, well, imagine if I said that I can't even think of a strange enough job, because you see, in most jobs, you're looking for generic attributes. You don't care about, I mean, there are going to be people that are going to be more suitable for being employed and people that are going to be less suitable for being employed, and you should interview all the candidates and perhaps employ the person that's most suitable for your bottom line, for the success of your business and your business model. Having personal judgment on these, this is difficult because in some sense, I mean, this is where affirmative action got so poisonous. Essentially, the idea that I mean, in some sense, all the affirmative action stuff that was created was in some sense completely designed for big businesses that have already bureaucracies and human relations departments. What are they called? HR departments. And all those types of bureaucratic structures, they just want protocols. They just want, stipulations, and they want manuals to read and then to follow robotically. They want robotic kind of things. That doesn't cut it in the small and medium business world. You can't function like that. And also because of, let's say, the cut and dry stipulations that they have around affirmative action, which are themselves very destructive and poisonous, because in some sense they create such disgusting, perverse incentives that perpetuate disadvantage, that perpetuate racial consciousness and racial resentment. It's really disgusting. It's a testament to how an economy can shoot itself in the foot because it has an unintelligent government that does not care about being ethically on top of things. It does not care about morality. It cares more about finding an excuse to sell licenses to people and to create a more interventionist arbitration over all resource allocation within a society so that they can get their hands on more forms of maladministration and kleptocracy and opportunities for influence peddling. And so in some sense, the South African economy is riddled in some sense with red tape that was designed for big businesses that they can just cope well enough with that red tape. But small and medium businesses can never grow in such an atmosphere of just utter, and when you don't have a growing small and medium business economy in a developing country, you essentially don't have growth, which is why we haven't had growth in South Africa for so long, because of this kind of toxic mandate from government, which comes with it a very decrepit form of proto-fascist political discourse and resentment, which is in some sense, disguises the fact that government is in large respect the main contributing factor to why South Africa has been failing in the way that it's been failing for the time that it has been failing so very clearly and egregiously. and it has disgustingly allowed them to divert the pressure of its own maladministration onto essentially this doubled down doom spiral of a disgusting narrative of, in some sense, collective shame and collective blame on identitarian, sort of metrics and things like that, historical gripes, which quite frankly belie the fact that what is destroying South Africa is mostly the ANC government and the politics of the EFF in some sense, which is to a large extent the main political drive within the ANC itself, because that is how it parasitically steals money from the state through affirmative action legislation, which is not fit for purpose and is completely unconstitutional. Which should be challengeable in court and completely removed, because it is so racialist, it is so disempowering, and it is de facto so destructive in every way, shape, and form. It's sort of the opposite of a developmental state. And judges close their eyes because they're probably close or a part of the political cabal. They are ideologically attuned to it, or some other such disgusting, or they at least sympathize with the decrepit development of this corrupt, institutionalized corruption of the legal theory in order to facilitate what I've already described as the split prerogative. The problem of the split prerogative, but in some sense that shouldn't even be a problem, because prerogatives should not be a bar to challenging government. Anyway, so this issue of objective justification and something being relatively justified. In some sense, we can get a peek at what is objective justification while we are working ever more closely towards refining of, let's say, the idea that like indirect discrimination can be a subjective kind of conjecture, in some sense yes, but mostly no. It cannot be a subjective conjecture. It can be a subjective claim, which then is refined by counterclaim, by counter argument. And in some sense we have, let's say, objective reasonableness and objective frameworks and structures to understand if something can be considered indirect discrimination. But in some sense, indirect discrimination can only be ascertained in a very kind of very clear and obvious way. It cannot merely be a tendency. It cannot be, this kind of criteria has a tendency to indirectly lead to something that approximates indirect discrimination. No. It must be exactly indirect discrimination or not. It's something of the form of dolus indirectus. In the same way that in some sense, you get three types of dolus. Or in some sense, perhaps they're only, I guess it depends how you want to break it down, but there's dolus directus and dolus indirectus, and the third form is dolus eventualis. Dolus eventualis is not indirect discrimination, to use it as an analogy. It must be dolus indirectus, you see, essentially. Okay, that metaphor is a bit rough, perhaps. In some senses, more of an analogy than a metaphor, but I did technically go through what I went through, so I hope that will supplement that analogy. But I guess people who are legal experts will understand what I am driving at there. And so, in some sense, what I'm saying is that we must be very, very careful that we don't try to make, what is the phrase? This is embarrassing. I don't even know the phrase offhand. We must not make the perfect the enemy of the good. I wonder if I'm making the converse point of that in some sense. You must be careful the other way. That in some sense, although we might be able to make a tentative hypothetical argument that something is relatively justified, we cannot do that in the face of this kind of constitutional framework when we know for a fact that it is not objectively justifiable. When we know for a fact, and in some sense, we know for a fact that it's not objectively justifiable if someone makes a case, a practical case, that there was an alternative route, there was an alternative policy, there was an alternative program that would have brought about the same legitimate purpose in a less infringement of somebody else's constitutional rights or in a less restrictive means, then we know for a fact that in some sense it cannot be relatively justifiable. It cannot be good because there is already a better good on the table. There is really, in some sense you would know, and yes, in some sense it's such a usually law does not want to make such obvious common sense, kind of findings, because in some sense they are so abject they are so abjectly prone to, let's say, common opinion of the day or something like that, or in some sense they are, because in some sense that sensibility has been so abused in the moral discourse of the current public, that in some sense journalism has been trading on the fact that you could slander and diabolically deceive people just based on decontextualizing issues and framing expert false authorities as being the person to follow unquestioningly just because they suggest that you can save lives or something like that. That we're trying to do the right thing and that's good enough. We can't prove that we're doing the right thing, but because we supposedly fear for people's safety and security, you have to let us tell you what to do. Never mind the medium and long-term sustainability. Never mind the long-term consequences. Never mind the tunnel vision of this very solipsistic, or let's say, let me not use these big labels, let me rather say, never mind that they don't give an account of their own unseriousness, of their own uncarefulness and their own untruthfulness. These COVID experts that tell us, well, let's just have a perpetual lockdown. Never mind that, there's going to be another COVID strain at some point. And if there isn't another COVID strain, let's just imagine that we stop all COVID viruses completely. And old people can just continue getting as old as they want to get and as unfit as they may be in their elderly age. And then what will happen? Perhaps we'll get a radical form of tuberculosis then. Because now, instead of having the old being culled by these viruses, because that's what COVID does, is it kills 80% of old people, and in some sense, do you know how many people swine flu killed? And now we're all going to lock down countries when there are new viruses. Is that what we're going to do? So we're all going to be insulated, so that we can all not be exposed to each other's viruses and gain immunity to each other's viruses. We're all going to be isolated in our each little pockets of our each little own country. And then every time that there's a new outbreak or something like that, we're going to lock down. And then we'll never be able to communicate and have international travel in some sense ever again, except by mandate of that you have all the right vaccines. So we now commit ourselves to under the medical care instead of having the care of our own immunology, of our own evolved and sustainable way, because we don't know what these viruses do. We don't know what kind of epigenetic function they serve us Are we really going to take that do these medical professionals really know what the hell that they're doing? Do they even know anything about the immune system? I mean, I'm sure they know some things, but do they know anything about the subject as a whole? I very much doubt it, in fact. In fact, I've heard from myself, from experts, the understanding that international travel has been much better for human health. We used to have deadly pandemics that killed children. We no longer. This COVID-19 does not kill children. It kills old people, essentially. It's in some sense indistinguishable from the normal influenza that we have. Yes, it is slightly novel, but we must also understand that the flu season that we had just before hardly killed anyone. So there's an excess propensity for mortality because of COVID, because the regular flu season didn't kill as many people as usually die every year from the regular influenza. You know how many people swine flu killed in the first year? Supposedly, swine flu killed. I mean, it's hard because, obviously now we've got a different way of counting the cases and counting the mortality numbers in some sense. Um, but this is hardly that much more serious than swine flu, especially when you take into account that we had, in some sense, depressed mortality from having a weaker strain of influenza this year. Also, that we can collectively be more secure, supposedly, so that what? In the future, we will all be completely dependent on having vaccines for every new strain that comes out so that we can prevent old people from dying, so that what? So that we can end up creating a more virulent and so we can end up incubating more potent viruses and things like that in people that in some sense are living beyond their own immunological substrate, and therefore will perhaps incubate something that will be far more deadly for the rest of us as we all hunker down in our isolated countries. We were much more healthy when we were exposing ourselves to each other. That was how we didn't have any deadly influenzas for such a long time. In the olden days, when you just had ship travel, when people used to travel across the seas with ships, there would be deadly outbreaks that would kill children. Every 20 to 30 years, there would be a serious deadly flu. That doesn't happen anymore. COVID-19 is not on that scale. It does not kill children in the same way that it kills old people. In some sense, there is a particular vulnerability of people that have, well, in some sense, compromised health in general, but specifically also asthmatic or lung or some kind of condition that affects their lungs. Um, because essentially part of what kills people with COVID is the chemical intake of oxygen into the bloodstream or something like that. And so I know, I'm surprised that they haven't come up with a therapeutic that was sort of or that's more massively available, that is kind of premised on how people treat cyanide poisoning. Because in some sense, you need to kind of treat it in a similar conceptual fashion to how cyanide poisoning is treated. So, because in some inflating the lungs with oxygen does not help if the chemical hemoglobin or whatever is not able to uptake the oxygen from the lungs because of a chemical suppression that's going on because of the virus. So you need a kind of a chemical workaround, which in some sense ventilation does not mechanically really improve that much. But this kind of hypothetical fear mongering and the damage that we have done to the economy, the damage that we have done to human life because of the damage that we have done to the economy, is certainly a kind of, I mean, it just shows the level of unaccountability and unseriousness in government, and also in the judicial failing to kind of push back against these unwarranted inroads into civil liberty, into the rights in the Bill of Rights. Supposedly for the good of all. No, that can't just be justified as a hypothetical. It has to be justified in actually looking at what government is mandating and what other means would have achieved the same procedure, and in fact would have perhaps been more effective, because people are going to break rules anyway if they're not educated in the purpose of the mandate. And so therefore, if the mandate is overly prescriptive, then in some sense you are miseducating people as to the value of the regulation in the first place. The idea that you are going to be able to police people from not doing what they want to do for 9 days out of 10 days is not going to stop the virus if on the 10th day they all go and make a gathering and they can't be cooped up in their houses. So instead of being able to find ways to do things sustainably in an educated manner in which that they are learning how to protect themselves, especially if they are vulnerable, but in some sense, some people that are young and healthy and fit should not be trying to protect themselves. They should be trying to achieve herd immunity for the vulnerable so that this can actually come to an end. So that we're all not just perpetually dependent on vaccines from here until kingdom come. I mean, this is completely unsustainable. And it is also not warranted by the level of mortality that this virus is prone to causing. It's completely disproportionate. And in some sense, our health sector would have been in a much better place if we had achieved herd immunity after the first wave, because the second wave is more virulent and it's worse, perhaps, on people's healths. So it would have been better if it had spread faster through the population before the second wave mutated. And in some sense, by slowing the spread of the virus for no good reason, because of just wanting to slow the spread of the virus, we increased the incubation factor, because the virus got maximum incubation before slowly spreading to the next person, and then maximum incubation before slowly spreading to the next person. That is how you get mutation. If we had accelerated, if we had encouraged the fit, young, and healthy people to go out and achieve herd immunity, while the vulnerable quarantined themselves and segregated themselves, and the rest of us could have been economically productive and even helped to support those of us who we know are vulnerable, community support would have been stronger. People would have been more able to support the vulnerable as well, in general, and we would have come to a resolution where we don't have to continue this, in some sense, sabotaged economy, all based on hysterical rhetoric and propaganda and irresponsible journalists who won't even properly debate or investigate the issue or ask after experts that give the contrarian line to the political mismanagement of this mess. As freedom of speech is encroached upon, as people have their videos deleted and taken down for making such obviously debatable comments. I mean, it's disgusting. I mean, this is 1984. This is Big Brother doublespeak in some sense. We're doing it for your security, so you're allowed to be censored. No, it doesn't work like that. You should go to jail, not me, for talking out against your tyrannical and unconstitutional infringement of people's constitutional rights. We had a democratic revolution in this country for a reason, and you don't get to suspend that because you're an unaccountable political mess who needs to look like a strong man, who needs to create propaganda just to validate and legitimize what is an obviously institutionally corrupt state in many different ways. And just because you've got the backing of these disgusting academics that are race and gender studies infused with their political pseudo-intellectualism and moral corruption, and you've got a contingent of journalists who are willing to pander to this disgusting proto-fascistic bullshit, and you've got, you know, you've got a Speaker of the House that can't even censure these fascists in Parliament, as they themselves will argue on behalf of the ANC party line, as the Speaker themselves. I mean, the whole thing is decrepit. The whole thing is, you know, the question really is can the South African system, can the South African Constitution and the nation of the new South Africa, can it be resuscitated? Can it be resurrected from its murder and betrayal across the board? And this is the moral corruption that has precipitated the fall of the state. And in some sense, I think the academy was corrupted first. It was the race and gender studies. They led the way for the rest of these evil people to listen with their itching ears something that would help facilitate their disgusting racialist propaganda to disguise their own malfeasance and corruption. Anyway, I can only complain about this on and on and on so much, but I do think that in some sense the idea that do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good has been weaponized in some sense in a very uncareful way. And that is somewhat the credo of this proto-fascistic malfeasance and degeneration of our values as a nation and our values as a culture. But also it has facilitated, in some sense, such dysfunctional governmental policy that, you know, the country is heading into an abyss. And in some sense, it is an abyss which the country inherently deserves for not correcting itself, for not voting out these people, or for not threatening revolution against a judiciary. I mean, in some sense, I don't want a revolution against the government. I mean, I don't want a revolution against the democracy. What is unjustifiable is the corruption, the institutionalized corruption in the judiciary. That is unacceptable. There is no excuse for that. That, in my view, requires either a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the judges involved in this corruption, or it requires well, if calamity does befall this country, that those are the people that need to be in the docks of a Nuremberg trial, of a human rights commission, or of a specially established a human rights tribunal and trial for the abuses, not even of the human rights that went on in this country, but the abuses of the South African Constitution that were perpetrated by these legal positivists and these fascistic intellectuals with their fascistic philosophies and racial consciousnesses and their betrayal of the South African Constitution and its values. There is no excuse. There can be forgiveness if there is rectification, and swiftly so. But in some sense, there is no excuse, because we had our revolution. We had our hard-fought revolution. It was costly. And what did they do with it? They sold it for what? For racial pride and for greed or corruption and kleptocracy, because they could easily excuse it to themselves with their disgusting ideological narrative and racialist propaganda, with their cabal of decrepit academics and identity politics miscreants. Almost just to prove my point, this evening I saw a news story about the police chief, a new story about the Minister of Police. Let me find it now. I took screenshots of it, so I guess I'll have to get it from that. Looks like it's evaporated. Screenshots. Send in the troops. Okay, so this is an article. Malibongwe Deimani. Excuse the mispronunciation. Send in the troops. Cele confirms SANDF will help police patrol garden route beaches. SANDF is the South African National Defence Force. So he's literally mobilizing national soldiers to help with police. Now, I understand, the mobilization of national defense forces to help in keeping the peace. This is nothing to do with keeping the peace. This is to do with already regulation which is unconstitutional and which is being used to promote racialist propaganda and essentially anti-constitutional proto-fascists. Anyway, let me get into the issue. Let me read the article. So, he said people are visiting the region's 57 beaches, giving police a tough time despite beaches having been closed under current lockdown regulations. There were complaints of non-compliance, especially after the declaration that beaches are no-go areas. I must say that in the West Coast we found that compliance is much better, with the exception of Langebaan, where people are still surfing and all that. It's unfortunate that we have to make some few arrests there. Cele said the suspects arrested for disregarding lockdown regulations were Europeans. I don't know why they would do this here when they know that there is a lockdown in Europe. I am sure it is some kind of undermining the state authority here. Cele said he decided to visit the garden route after receiving information that people were not adhering to the beach ban. The minister said he was made aware that beachgoers only comply when police and other law enforcement officers visit the beaches and return to the beaches when the police leave. For that reason, today we expect to be reinforced by the South African Defence Force to be here today to assist SA Police Service members to enforce the regulations that says people should not be on the beaches. Cele said the presence of SANDF members was a welcome relief as many police officers have been put out of action after testing positive for COVID-19. We have quite a significant number infected here, about 350 of them, but besides you need to isolate even if you are not declared sick, so we have a further 800 in isolation, so our numbers are very down. Cele said the unfortunate part of the non-compliance to lockdown regulations is that people will end up with criminal records. We are calling on people to just comply. This is not something we like, it is because it is necessary and compulsory. Speaking to the media, Cele also warned liquor traders selling alcohol underground to desist. Implied the in square brackets. Unfortunate part of it is, this is a quote, that's why it's in square brackets. Unfortunate part of it is that when we get you your trading license will be taken and you will not trade when trading is allowed back. Cele said it was painful that ordinary South Africans who were supposed to think for themselves need police to remind them that COVID-19 was real. It is somewhat ironic that in his own series of quotations, he lays out essentially the profanity and the vanity of the idea that you can essentially restrict people in this way, in this overbearing, overreached way, in also in an unintelligent and unaccountable way in terms of the government policy that is trying to do this. Instead of prohibiting people from using the beaches in gatherings between strangers, it says, no, you just can't go to the beach at all. Instead of making regulations that actually make sense, the whole justification is, and we've heard this all before in terms of COVID-19, that in terms of, for example, where the government has tried to overturn essentially what has already been, when the courts have already declared that, for example, there are bans on tobacco and there are bans on alcohol, or at least the ban on alcohol, at least the ban on tobacco was essentially quashed or in court. It was declared unconstitutional, but now, because the government already plans to appeal, I believe that judgment is effectively, in terms of the effect of that judgment, is held sort of in abeyance until it works out if there is leave to appeal granted or not, or if the appeal finalizes, essentially, because of how the judgment was worded. That until the legal question sort of resolves, or has a kind of final sort of thing, that the judgment is kind of provisional or tentative, in that it doesn't take effect, or the effect of the judgment is provisional on essentially the matter being somewhat laid to rest, which it is not, because of the government's intention to seek leave to appeal. Anyway, what is particularly irresponsible here is essentially is how this already useless regulation, which is completely irrational, the idea that as if the public interest is just a binary on whether COVID-19 causes damage to people's health, as if there aren't other ways to cause damage to people's health, as if having a police chief spout racialist propaganda and proto-fascistic nonsense in the airwaves, as if that isn't impacting my mental and physical health, by having to deal with the stress of having a police chief that should himself cool his heels in a jail cell for the constitutional damages that he has, in some sense, used the excuse of COVID-19 in order to make it look like that he's an important person doing an important function, when instead he is just part of the facade of institutionalized corruption. And I mean that specifically in relation to COVID-19. The idea that you can just say that the public interest is a simple binary over whatever it is that the government of the day wishes to say that it's all about, and therefore everyone's constitutional rights get suspended, can be infringed without any... And you can also then have South African police forces using SANDF, using the National Defence Force to help police beaches. How is this at all proportional? How is this at all reasonable? The fear of the law, for what objective aim? To help in suspending and infringing the Constitution, which has de facto been infringed by this kind of embarrassing and disgusting rhetoric. And then on the back of this embarrassing and disgusting rhetoric, you have all of this hateful, disgusting, racialist propaganda. Do you know who has illegitimized the law in South Africa. It is the South African government. And it is also the courts that have not stepped up to the plate and ruled against this kind of nonsense, and in some sense made a declarator, but also in some sense censured and rebuked the police minister for this kind of disgusting performance. This brazen, authoritarian, tyrannical dramatization, in some sense trying to validate the kind of simplistic and unintelligent policy that government does because it's for the greater good. Now, let me just get into this issue as to why it is almost by definition that is almost by definition when I say almost by definition, I mean in the sense of almost common sense, how it cannot be correct that you create rules and regulations now I'm going to read a tenet of something. The group member should not permit laws to be passed which limit or proscribe the activities of all the members of the group because of the failure of some of the members of the group. This is an abuse of policing. The idea that you cannot make a regulation that says that you cannot have gatherings on a beach and that you cannot be crowded densely on a beach or something like that, or create some kind of that people on the beaches should be a certain distance from other people on the beaches or something like that. The idea that you couldn't have less restrictive measures to achieve the same public health aims or whatever you want. And in some sense, it's actually very debatable the value of slowing down the spread. I mean, at this point when the hospitals are full, perhaps. But before, when we were slowing down the spread of COVID, it was certainly unintelligent to do so, and in some sense made the population much more vulnerable to a mutated variant, which we could have already had achieved some level of herd immunity to if we didn't have this mindless, endless slowdown of the spread of COVID, which was for what purpose? We didn't even know that a vaccine was coming, and we still don't even know if the vaccine will work on variations. This is completely unsustainable. Do you know how many people died from swine flu and we didn't do any of this kind of nonsense? We have damaged public health much more by our overreaction to COVID. And then they just use it as propaganda as they spout their racialist nonsense. It's disgusting. This idea that policing only works in an all in a false dichotomous way, that it's either extreme or it's nothing, as if there's no middle ground, as if there's no education that can be done. And when you have this kind of unintelligent restriction, what you end up doing is you end up promoting the misunderstanding of the whole situation, because you do not allow people to make intelligent decisions. This is why you have super spreaders. Because we have not said, yes, young people should go, young, fit, healthy people should be segregated somewhat from people that are vulnerable, and then those young, fit, healthy people should go and actually get it, because more than half of them will just even be completely asymptomatic. So you won't even be able to at least in an obvious way track the spread of it. But at least then we would be much further along to reaching herd immunity, and young people wouldn't have the opportunity cost of this lockdown, which is immense. When you actually calculate the opportunity cost to public health that the overreaction and the unintelligent policy and regulation that this government has promulgated, not to mention the whole unscientific health implication of the unsustainability of it all. Are we going to, at every new COVID development, lock all countries down, lock everyone down? Until when? And you know that the more that you lock people down, the less that people's immune systems ever acclimatize and reach herd immunity. And then when you do have an outbreak and you do have a mutation, it exacerbates it.
because we haven't been exposed, because now we've got more of these pockets that the virus isn't reaching that point at which that it becomes you have to realize, if you go to war with a virus, it's going to get more deadly. That's what happens. It wants to live. If you try to vaccinate a virus into nothingness, you're going to have an arms race. That's a biological arms race. That's a form of human experimentation on a societal level. Do you know we used to have deadly flus every 20 to 30 years? They don't happen anymore. Do you know what my definition of a deadly flu is? My definition of a deadly flu is that it kills children as much as it kills the elderly. This virus does not kill children anywhere close to the level at which it kills the elderly. In some sense, it's a technical formality that it might be described as a pandemic, but it is not a deadly pandemic. It does not threaten the lives of children by and large. Generally speaking, the only lives of children it may threaten are the lives of children that were already severely immunocompromised or already had existing health conditions and such and such. But children as a category are not vulnerable to this virus as such a category as child. This is not a deadly pandemic. This is much the same as swine flu, and we did nothing like this for swine flu, and the hospitals were also overrun in the first months of swine flu. And we got over it, and we reached herd immunity, and we got over it quickly. But because we have drawn out this virus, we have actually made it worse. And this kind of public policy, this public health policy, is a human experimentation that will lead to more deadly viruses. The idea that we're going to preserve the lives of the elderly indefinitely will mean that we will keep them around for long enough so that they can incubate some other more deadly virus, that they might promulgate some botulism or some tuberculosis. I mean, there is an epigenetic balance here at work. We cannot just say that we're going to have no disease and then you are playing an all or nothing game. Are you going to vaccinate for every single virus from here until kingdom come? Because if you're not, then actually we need COVID, you understand. Otherwise you get forest fires. If you don't have small fires, you get forest fires. That's how viruses and humanity have co-evolved. So if you're going to put a wrench and a spanner into that, do you know what you're going to go back to? You're going to go back to the deadly flus. You're going to go back to the times of deadly flu. Or we're going to be completely dependent on pharmaceutical companies to keep on pumping us full of vaccines so that we can get back to our passport and have air travel again. And that will be very unsustainable, and we're going to have, typhoid Marys all over again. It will be back in the days of old, when we used to travel from shore to shore, and then there would be a deadly outbreak, and you would have as many young people dying in the same rates as the elderly were dying. That's a really deadly pandemic. This is not a really deadly pandemic. This is a politically contrived bullshit moral panic and hysteria created by identity politics. Identity politics got people programmed into being reactive to the idea that if the public good is threatened because someone's security is threatened, then policy and politics must do whatever it can to avoid the damage, and then it doesn't matter what havoc they wreak. Doesn't matter what collateral damage in their overreaction is. And that's the level of corruption that we have in our country, and we have a police chief that is, in some sense, leader of that institutionalized form of corruption. He's the ringleader. He's the mafia kingpin. He's even got the hat. He's brazenly signaling to people that his sympathy and his compassion is the law, is the personality of the law itself. And he calls down the South African Defence Force to police the beaches. How about calling down the South African Defence Force and cleaning up the ANC government? Thank you very much. And that organized crime. No. Instead, he's got the South African police force cleaning up the beaches from the citizens that just want their civil liberties. This is institutionalized corruption. This is unconstitutional. This is crazy. This is the antithesis of policing. This is the undoing of the rule of law. And this is the conspicuous rule of man. This is so unconstitutional, so unlawful, and the jurisprudence and the judges that will not rule against it have illegitimized their own station and their own role in the South African system and legal tradition and constitutional order. And they have betrayed the values of the Constitution as they brazenly undermine the value of non-racialism, which is in some sense the theme of both identity politics and of the police chief, as he creates this disgusting rhetoric and this disgusting propaganda that wonderfully tie all of the ANC sentiments, all of the ANC to loop this back into the disgusting corruption of the jurisprudence in South Africa, the propaganda and the legal theory that has validated this disgusting propaganda is that the prerogative of the ANC to flex its muscles with this kind of racialist garbage. To what end? You see the silly rationalization that he has to put at the end of this article, that, they need to police the beaches to prove to South Africans who are supposed to think for themselves that COVID-19 is real. How about COVID-19 is real and we can use the beaches? How about we can actually do both of those things at the same time? And you actually police regulations that are reasonable instead of regulations that are unconstitutional. Is it too much to ask that you actually do your constitutional function? Or are you so dysfunctional that you can only function when you've got an excuse to spout your racialist propaganda? And here we see that the ANC is essentially a shell for EFF-style politics, and our democracy is being hard-boiled between the hard place of the ANC and the rock that is the EFF, and between those two poles, we'll just be driven into the sea, I guess, with this kind of racialist nonsense. As the state becomes ever more fascistic in its, in some sense, in its legal theory, in its policy, in its regulation, in its unconstitutionality. I say that it's the police minister who should be charged criminally with constitutional damages. He is the one who should be arrested, in some sense. This is brazen. This is brazenly disgusting and unconstitutional. And there is no sensitivity to this within the public discourse, because the journalists themselves and the race and gender academics with their identity politics, racial mongering, identity mongering, have sold to people this false bill of goods, this false way of liberation. Oh yes, obviously the reason why we're not doing well is because we need to send in the army to the beaches. That's the real problem in this country. It's not the problem that we're not having a reasonable debate over COVID-19 regulations, which are themselves insane, which are themselves disproportionate, which are themselves wholly irresponsible, unaccountable politics at its worst. But, this is the style of ANC governance. You create a false consciousness, you create a false story, and as long as it's okay in America, then that's good enough. As long as you can kind of hitch yourself to the bandwagon of what other countries are doing, then that's good enough. You just follow the trend. South Africa has the best legal tradition in the world, and it stands in ruin, essentially. It stands betrayed in order to facilitate this kind of political institutionalized corruption. This is why we are failing as a nation, and why we have only destroyed our hope and opportunity for progress and transformation, is because we have a labile government. We have a government prone to irrational, hysterical pontification and performances, and essentially a kind of misdirection, a magic trick show, of a weird kind of fraud, a weird kind of public performance art. I can forgive many things in the political discourse because, let's say democracy is sometimes ugly. What is inexcusable is the abuse of the legal system, and the development of the legal system to incline itself towards this institutionalized corruption in the political arena. I've discussed it before in terms of the split prerogative, but the group member should not permit laws to be passed which limit or proscribe the activities of all the members of the group because of the failure of some of the members of the group. It's a very simple point. It's common sense, really. It's axiomatically common sense. And in some sense, if you have a society that can't even respect that iota of common sense and decency, you live in a society that is predicated on denigrating some people for the vanity of other people and the pride, the racialist, disgusting propaganda of some other group. And if they think that that is the way for progress and transformation, and they've sold people the false bill of goods that that is the way to achieve some kind of improvement along some metric or dimension, I mean, then you've sold people into the slavery of their own insanity and unreasonableness and irrationality. I mean, if you can sell people that bait and switch, then essentially you don't have a democracy at that point. Well, I mean, legally, in some sense, we've already given that up. The level of the legal theory that has descended, the level of the level of dissent in the legal theory in order to validate that kind of political rhetoric and that kind of political formulaic abuse of democracy, which now has in some sense been legally uh, passed off by the courts. And the inclination of the people essentially to have which have essentially been drummed up into a frenzy by this kind of political rhetoric, but also um, the pathetic attitudes of the journalistic class, of the sense making class, and how they have merely echoed uh, uh, the kind of profane political formula of the institutionalized corruption of our day. We stand betrayed on all sides. We stand betrayed by academics that should themselves be in jail for constitutional damages, for undermining non-racialism and the values of the New South Africa, undermining justice itself even, and promoting proto-fascistic values and a disgusting form of legal positivism, which then bled itself into the legal theory, with also American scholars inclining our judges to follow in their ideas of that the government has some kind of special prerogative, a government prerogative which is not mentioned in the Bill of Rights, which is not mentioned in the Limitations Clause. with their disgusting American test of a legitimate government purpose and rationality. That is not the rule of law. That is not the rule of law in the South African legal tradition. But they have betrayed everything for their institutionalized political corruption, for their observance and worship of the ANC and its new course into this racialist propaganda. The new South Africa stands murdered and betrayed. The question is, can it be resurrected? And in some sense, I don't even ask for the political side of the equation. I don't care about the political side of the equation. I care about the legal side of the equation. We had a hard-won revolution, democratic revolution, and our republic is founded with a supreme constitution. We have an open liberal democracy, which de facto has been overrun now, which de facto has been quashed by these war criminals in the making as they continue to hardboil our democracy into fascism with their expert, rational, logical versions of things. And they ignore simple common sense. Less restrictive means to achieve the same purpose without infringing the right. You just have to read the limitations clause to know that this is bullshit. You just have to read section 9 quite clearly to realize that in some sense now everything that the government does, every regulation that the government does is some form of version of affirmative action or something like that, which even the affirmative action side of the law is fundamentally corrupt. The Promotion of Equality Act 2009 is itself, is wholesale corrupt, is wholesale inconsistent with the Constitution. And that's what happens when you try to get legal American scholarship into the program, because they have a legal tradition which is terrible, which is quite frankly 300 years old, and is not fit for purpose, and it does not facilitate the rule of law. They have a due process system. We don't have a due process system. We have laws of general application and equal protection under the law, as enshrined by Section 9 of the Constitution, which is the practice of equality, which must be read in conjunction with the limitations clause. There is no right to equality in South Africa. We have the practice of equality, which is how all the rights in the Constitution are to be fairly balanced and treated in controversial in issues before the court. I've gone through these in the recording that this is adjacent to. I already went through this, so I'll just take that as somewhat explored. But anyway, so I just wanted to document this for posterity, perhaps for I am thinking of trying to, I don't know all the procedure of these things, but I am thinking of trying to make an application to the High Court. I might need some procedural assistance on how to formulate it. But it is something that I could conceivably try to produce the application by myself in the public interest. And on behalf of myself as well. Even though I haven't used the beaches, I would say maybe I've used them once in the last 4 years, but anyway, something like that. But it's the principle. I mean, just to be blunt, there are some very simple reformulation of the restrictions which would ostensibly achieve the same aims. You could simply say everyone should be 2 meters away from anybody else who is not from the same household on a beach, on a public beach. So if someone already shares your same household with you, then the distance restriction shouldn't matter, but you shouldn't have to wear a mask at the beach if you can stay 2 meters away from other people. not in the open air with the sunlight. Um, and essentially, I mean, look, I don't know, maybe you can change those numbers up or whatever, but as well, I mean, the idea, I mean, there are people that surf. I mean, why would you stop them from surfing when they might just want to go and surf, and they can do so perfectly by themselves, and they don't need to be around other people, so they would essentially just want to use the beaches by themselves, and when they're out in the sea, there's no one around them, or there's certainly enough distance between the people that they're around that it won't matter, and there's so much salt water that's going to probably dissipate any of the. I mean, I don't think the virus can essentially do anything in the medium of the sea. Through the medium of the sea, I very much doubt it. So this is an over restriction which is unnecessary. This restriction goes too far. You could just have another set of restrictions that would ostensibly achieve the same aim, and it would be less restrictive, and in some sense it would be more informative, because then in some sense you would also create a model in which other people could understand the less restrictive restriction and understand the meaning of it, understand the reasoning of it, and apply that to their other activities, and then you wouldn't have the issue of super spreaders, because you would perhaps have uh, already you would have set up models in people's minds, set up understandings in people's minds, so that they could use those restrictions to facilitate how they find a best practice for facilitating something else that they might want to do, that there isn't an explicit restriction about. But when it's all or nothing, when you're saying you must be completely isolated, what is the function of that? It doesn't have a good function, because people are going to eventually break those restrictions. And then what? And then you're just going to have another giant surge. And you never get into herd immunity. You never get into any kind of sustainable practice. It's completely unsustainable. This form of regulation is so unintelligent. It is so badly designed. What is the function of it? To make the gym close at an earlier time. Okay, in one sense, people that are going to the gym in some sense should, or are perhaps generally going to be more fit and healthy, and those that aren't are going to choose not to go to a public place. So, public preference, or a person's individual preference for that. But in some sense, the idea that, I mean, again, I'm very much for healthy, fit people making themselves exposed to the virus so that we can get herd immunity faster, is a much more intelligent route, also, which would stop us from having mutations and variations in the virus as well, which we could have been doing that when the hospitals weren't full. But instead, we continued to slow the spread until we got a mutation, and then it spread like wildfire, because the mutation spread was more virulent, was more contagious. Whereas we could have already had people that had herd immunity before. But because we slowed it down, because I mean, first of all, yes, maybe some people that got the old one was also susceptible to the variation, but many people that got the old one, that would have been enough for them to kind of get immune for quite a lot, for quite a long while. People have different types of immuno mechanisms within themselves. And I'm not willing to listen to the people who don't understand the science well enough to just cotton on to anything that they've heard. Oh, you're only immune for 3 months or something like that. Maybe some people, maybe a very few amount of people only gain immunity for 3 months. But there are a lot of different immunomechanisms that different people have with different. We're not all the same as human beings. We all have different types of mechanisms within us. Um, the immune system is a very complex thing. It's something that is not actually fully understood. Okay, so the thing around this as well is that when we cater to these hypothetical worst case scenarios, or perhaps they're not, I mean, who knows if they're worst case scenarios or not, but when we cater to hypothetical speculation about, let's say, management into the future, when people who are supposedly experts do not give full declarations about the limits of the knowledge of the field that they are experts in, and also the limits of themselves as practitioners within that field, when they don't openly talk about the kind of controversy that exists within the field, but they instead just tell you about their opinionated, their supposedly expert opinion about the likely course or something like that. And we don't even know where that likely course lands us up, by the way. You know, the idea is that, well, if you do what I say, then supposedly we avoid these deaths. And then what happens next flu season when there's a new COVID strain or there's another influenza? So we saved some people just to die a year later. And when we get a new strain, are we going to lock everything down again? And again, these are not deadly. These are not deadly flus. A deadly flu is a flu, or a dangerous deadly flu. Look, I'm trying to create a heading. I'm trying to create a terminology here, but I would say a real deadly pandemic is one that kills children at the same rate that it kills adults. This flu does nothing like that. This flu hardly kills children at all. It does, in some sense, it does not kill children as a category. It only kills the children that are already severely immunocompromised or have severe health conditions already, pre-existing health conditions. But children as a category are, in some sense, frankly, unaffected by this virus, or they are as affected as any other disease might statistically have a representation in that, across, uh, you know, in some sense, it's such a far outlier. But, and again, when you put in the opportunity cost that we're placing on society in order to pander to this siren call, which is itself a kind of journalistic hit piece in some sense. I mean, this was all created by the media. And in some sense, it was all created by the American media because the Democrats really wanted something to have a dig at Trump, and the European Union, really wanted something to have a dig at Britain during Brexit. In some sense, it was very politically opportune. It was very politically useful to some people in the media, because the general media establishment in America is essentially run by the liberal side of politics. And so this was very convenient. And if you really compare this to swine flu and look at how the media covered swine flu in America, did you know that all the hospitals in America were also overrun during swine flu in America? And did you see the coverage of swine flu on the news in America? Nothing like COVID, not even a little bit like COVID. And the kind of decontextualization and fakery in the news. Trump said that COVID was a hoax. That's not what he meant. He already banned all traveling from China to America. So obviously he's not saying that the virus isn't real. He's saying that the coverage of it was surreal. That's what he meant when he said the hoax is the coverage of COVID. How COVID is being covered by the media. That was the hoax, essentially. And he was right. And he was right, I would even argue, pretty much all along. The reaction to the virus can't be worse than the virus itself. The treatment can't be worse than the illness. How can you condone treating of public health in such a way where your treatment has a higher public health consequence than the actual illness itself that it's supposedly reacting to. All to prevent us from getting herd immunity so that we can instead get a vaccine instead. I mean, it's crazy. So now we can become completely dependent on vaccines because we'll just close everything down. The new so every season now there'll be a COVID vaccine, and so all of our elderly will not die to influenza now because we're going to develop vaccines, or at least they won't die. I guess we'll still have influenza, but if we've got now a vaccine for COVID, maybe we'll have a vaccine for the other flu. Um, and then what will happen to us? So then, when we have tuberculosis now, we'll start breeding superbacteria now because all the people that are immunocompromised that were otherwise going to be taken up by flu, well, we won't have the flu anymore because we'll just kind of either have very, very deadly flus when we have them, because we won't develop vaccines for those ones and they'll get through the net, and we'll have a lot of people that are very sickly, but they won't die because there won't be viruses to kill them, but they'll be good incubating vats for when something really deadly is ready to spill out over everything. So we're going to have a complete medical warfare with viruses and bacteria because we're going after them now. So you think that that's not going to be an unsustainable militarization? We've got our pharmaceutical guns, and we're going to gun down all the viruses now because that's where we're heading. That's the overarching strategy. Otherwise, this is not sustainable. If we don't commit ourselves to that path, to being completely welded to the medical pharmaceutical industry to give us vaccines, otherwise we're not allowed to travel. Otherwise, we're not allowed to have our countries open. Otherwise, we'll have travel bans between all the countries all the time unless we have a vaccine. So now we're just handing over the keys to the medical industry. The medical industry will dictate all public policy, and everything and anything will all be based on that. And who knows if they'll even tell us the truth. I mean, at some point when government gets this shady and authoritarian, tyrannical, they might just make stuff up. Maybe the whole variant thing, maybe it's not even a variant. Who knows? I mean, who verifies this science? Especially with numbers as low as this. I mean, already, again, this is, in some sense, you could say the resurge that we had now with this variation could be all somewhat the fact that the influenza that we had this season was very not deadly. Usually the flu season kills a lot of people. The actual flu in the flu season killed very few people, leaving a lot of people that would have usually died from a flu to die from something else, and then it died from COVID. So, there are all these things in public health which are just completely, no one cares because the propaganda is good enough to shout at somebody else and to make racialist nonsense. Public health is about the numbers. Public health is not about individual. It's not like personal medical care and health. You have to understand that whenever you do anything in public health, it has an opportunity cost. You are diminishing the days of life in the population. Listen to the polymaths. Listen to the statisticians who have looked into this stuff. I wish I could remember his name offhand, but yeah, I mean, the problem is that these so-called experts and specialists, they don't even understand their own field holistically. They don't understand the limits of their own subfield, and therefore they make these very hubristic kinds of promises and speculations and hysteria. And they don't even look at the other side of their own obtuse statements. The other possible hypotheticals and in some sense the shadow that they cast against the future. In the uncaveated, unqualified, they don't qualify what they say tentatively. They just frame it as a cautiousness, as a fear. They don't give both sides. There's a kind of unseriousness and uncarefulness about that. But yeah, the general sense of disproportionality, and also, in some sense, sadly, we can't even know uh, how much extra damage we have done to ourselves by essentially not allowing healthy, fit people to, in some sense, expose themselves to the virus before the mutation occurred, before the second variation happened. And breaking down this flow of, in some sense, information and epigenetics of an immunological exposure is only going to, in the long run, lead to more deadly outbreaks. And we're going to have, if we really are going to try to turn back the clock and lock everything down, we are really going to go back to when we had deadly flus every 20 and 30 years, seriously deadly flus that killed very young people. That stopped happening because of air travel. Many of the experts, that's what they believe in epidemiology. It is rough. Well, by the experts that I listen to, it is believed that it was in fact international air travel that ended the typhoid Mary, essentially, that ended the incredibly deadly outbreaks. We haven't had that for a long time. Public health has actually increased, it's gotten better. And now we're going to undermine all of that by locking everything down and trying to over medicate with vaccines. Anyway, I guess I can only repeat myself so many times.